Alright everyone, hello. And you know what? I got to thinking the other day. I talk a lot about Christian witchcraft, and I talk a lot about what it could be defined as. But with all this stuff going on in the world right now, I think it's really important to be explicitly clear about exactly what Christian witchcraft, not just as a title, but as a group, as a movement, really is. Because when I'm out here describing Christian witchcraft to people, I'm often describing it as Christians who are just using the power and, majesty of God to get closer to God, using his creation to get closer to, the world that he's made, and find harmony with it, to affect change in the world for better things. And of course, all of this sounds very well and good. In fact, all of this sounds like what we might, in earlier times, call mysticism, or even theurgy. Theurgy essentially being a very fancy word to say miracle working or just straight up magic with God. So knowing that Christian witchcraft at its core has always been essentially known as cunning folk wisdom, like folk wisdom, folk healing, theurgy, mysticism, all of which have had their place in the church over and over and over again. If we look at people like St. Hildegard von Bingen and so many other incredible miracle workers and philosophers and church fathers and so on and so forth, a lot of people's next step is to ask me, well, why are you calling it magic? Why are you calling it witchcraft then, and not just mysticism or theurgy? And this is where I get to the point where I tell you what Christian witchcraft really is. And that is a system in which all of us here are kind of fighting back against a corrupt institution. Christian witchcraft is not just a way of being. It's not just a type of religion. It's not just a method of engaging with Christ. It is in itself a political statement. Christian witchcraft is something that says we are going to be the face of that which you despise in order to reveal your hypocrisy. And it says that to the church. There is nothing that the church has been more concerned with than the devil and with witches. And therefore, when we say Christian witchcraft, even though what we're doing is well in line with Christian theology, Christian philosophy, Christian frameworks, and, cultural connection points, it's because we are doing as Paul says in Corinthians. Just as Paul says that God uses the weak to shame the strong, and he uses the foolish to shame the wise, so too are Christian witches, using the concept of the witch to shame the priest. There are a lot of people right now obsessed with good religion. They're obsessed with looking good. They're obsessed with acting good. They're obsessed with doing everything Jesus said not to do, which is to essentially try and perform righteousness rather than simply be righteous. And so that is where many people have said before that we are at the point where Jesus is not among the churches. If we remember the words of, this certain here archbishop, he said it very well himself.
God calls in the Satanists and Wiccans to save the church. My lives have been revealing. Never could I have imagined the level of hatred, vitriol, condemnation and prejudice that festers beneath the surface of so many sweet-faced Christians preaching about Jesus. It's time for the church and Christians to wake up and realise Jesus left them a long time ago. If they want to reconnect, they may well find him speaking to them through a Satanist, a Wiccan, a pagan, a member of another religion, or no religion at all, a rapper, a rioter, a rebel, or even the person next door. God is everywhere and in everyone, and the sooner Christians and the church realise that, the better.
And if we remember also the words of Jürgen Moltmann in The Crucified God, we understand very well that for people who are acting like you must act a certain way, you must look a certain way, you must go through life a certain way in order to be Christian, they're missing the point completely. The point of Christianity, the point of Christ's cross is not to make everyone conform the same way, but it's to meet everyone where they're at and to help everyone be who they authentically are. The church is supposed to be made of unlike persons. It's supposed to be made of people from all over, right? As the old adage says, it takes a village. It takes all kinds to make things happen, to raise the next generation, to do anything that a society requires. It takes all kinds of people. It doesn't only take one type of person. And so the church as a whole should be made of those unlike persons who come with all these different perspectives and backgrounds and beliefs and ideas and so much other stuff. It should not be made of only one type of person who are going only one type of way in life. But see, that right there, that concept is in and of itself against the dragon. The dragon believes in division, in separation, in hierarchical order. And we see that a lot in Christina Cleveland's, God is a Black Woman, where a lot of it has to do with hierarchy, dividing people into sections and then stacking those sections so that the people at the top never want to change anything because they got it good, and the people at the bottom have no power to change anything. And the thing about these hierarchical systems is that they often divide you into things that you cannot change. You cannot change the color of your skin. You cannot change, your sexuality or your gender, at least not in a way that is authentic to you, right? And if you are able to transition, say you are a trans person, then you becoming your authentic self is seen as a threat to other people who insist that you be born in this caste and you stay in it and you die in it. However, on the other hand, the concept of liberation theology that Jürgen Moltmann puts forward, this idea of using the witch to shame the priest, of Jesus fleeing the church to be among the people who have been abused and have been beaten and have been so terribly mistreated, this is threatening to the dragon. This is threatening to the concept of power because it unites people. And that's what Christian witchcraft is about. It's not about separating it. It's not just another denomination. Christian witches are of all denominations. They are of all people who follow Christ. Anyone who is any denomination of Christian can be a Christian witch. Anyone who believes in the message of Jesus can join and be among these people. And the message of Jesus isn't something about, rapture this and hellfire that. The message of Jesus is justice. The message of Jesus is resistance. The message of Jesus is malicious compliance and overthrowing imperialism with whatever tools you've got. It's feeding the poor and healing the sick and helping society from its lowest point so that the least of us can still live full, wonderful lives. And so we complicate a lot of things when we talk about Christian witchcraft. People have asked me a lot, what exactly is a Christian witch? There's so many people who ask me, what is a Christian witch? And the truth is that even if I never casted another spell in my life, I would always be a Christian witch, because what it means to be a Christian witch isn't just throwing basil into a jar or lighting candles and incense and doing all that kind of stuff. To be a Christian witch is to stand for a world that could be better than it is. Because the world's got a lot of problems right now. The world has a ton of problems, and while Christian witchcraft cannot fix them all, Christian witchcraft can give people who need something more than the crumbling institution of the church, they can give them something that can have them give that foundation, right? So this is the thing. When people are in the church and they're trying to get out, they're trying to stay with the message of Jesus, they're trying to stay with Jesus, but they don't want to be associated with these institutions that have hurt them and hurt their friends and hurt their loved ones so badly. Christian witchcraft creates a foundation. It says there is a long, ripe history of magic and mysticism, of direct communion with God, of activism, of good deeds, of good works, of helping others. There's a deep, long tradition of that, and you can find yourself in it when you understand the ways in which all of this works together. So at its simplest, Christian witchcraft isn't just about being a Christian and also being a witch. Being a Christian witch is about being an activist. It's about being a mystic. It's about being a healer. It's about being a seer. It's about being someone with the courage to speak when things are not correct. It's about someone who has the power to shout down the dangers of the world, to stand in front of people and know that they have much more than just their bodies to stand in front of people and shield them with. The more we look into all of these issues, like the travesty happening in Palestine, like, the Christian nationalism tearing up America, like the right-wing politics that try to use Jesus' name as a shield to commit such ridiculous and terrible atrocities, as we look at all the parts of the world where the governments are sending money to drop bomb after bomb after bomb while their people at home are starving, this is where Christian witchcraft becomes something more than just about being a Christian and a witch. This is where it becomes about truly understanding the message of God, the message of Christ, and understanding what it means to actually pick up the cross. And also what it means to walk out into a world full of people who are discarded and left behind, and to lift them back up. As Jürgen Moltmann says in The Crucified God, you won't find God in the churches. You have to walk out of the churches and into the slums, and that is where you find God. And the thing about it is that for Christian witches, there is a very different power out there. There is a very different power out there than the devil. A lot of Christian witches at this point, I believe, they do understand that the devil that the church always told us to fear is not the actual source of the problem here. The source of the problem is much more complicated to explain. It's not so cut and dry, it's not so easy. Once you understand exactly what it is, it seems clear and it seems easy, but until then, it requires a lot of background knowledge and it requires a lot of skill to understand it fully. I'm going to try to explain it a little bit to you now, but know that if you're going to look at God, the devil, Jesus, you got to look at them not as two factions of an opposing side on a battlefield, but rather a courthouse. God is judge. Jesus, or, for non-Christians, Archangel Michael, is advocate. And the devil, or Lucifer, or Hashatan, or whoever, is adversary. Advocate and adversary are just defense and prosecution. God is the judge. When you go into a courthouse, it might feel like a battle in some court cases, but in the end of the day, all of these people are working for the same situation. They're working under the same idea of justice. They are just trying to present two different sides of the information so that the judge can oversee it all and make that final decision. They're all still working together. They're all still working under the same branch. And in fact, if anything, this devil we've been told to fear is one of the ones doing some of the hardest, heaviest work when it comes to dealing with this actual evil that I'm about to explain. So when you talk to most Christians and they tell you about this battle of good versus evil, there are a lot of different ways we can spin this idea, right? Some people say it's us, we are the battle, it's our evil versus our good. Some people will say that it's God versus the devil. Some people will try to say it's like one nation versus another, so on and so forth. They'll say it's one religion versus another. They will keep going and piecemealing it to the end of time, but the reality is that any fight for good and evil we could talk about has nothing to do with anything that is on Earth. It has nothing to do even with the stories that we tell ourselves that make up good and evil. Perpetually, when we talk about good and evil, especially from a Christian witch's perspective, I feel like what we really need to talk about is the behind the scenes of the story. Because the seeds of it are scattered everywhere you look. Everywhere you look, there will be some hint of this evil that I'm about to explain. And in fact, when we have mystics and theologians like Christina Cleveland in her book, God is a Black Woman, talk about it, one of the most striking things she says about it is that this thing, this evil, is a shapeshifter. She calls it the white male god or the Father Sky god, as in this very distant and out of the way and disinterested God who only wants anything to do with us if we are perfect and pure and wonderful. And she also, mentions white male God as in the God that seems to, for some reason, prioritize white men over literally all other people in creation. And the thing about this is that this creature, this thing that we're going to talk about, is also more what we would consider in line with the evangelical egregore, which I have talked about before. You can see that video a little bit earlier. The truth is, Christina Cleveland is exactly right. This thing is a shapeshifter, and that we can see this evil creature show up, all over the place in American politics right now, with Christian nationalism on the rise, with people trying forcefully to embed Christianity and a specific type of Christianity into political and secular institutions. For example, Texas trying to replace school counselors with chaplains is an example of Christian nationalism and trying to put God back in schools in a way that is detrimental to pretty much everybody. That's an example of Christian nationalism. So is to our new Speaker of the House saying all the wild, zany things he's been saying that really don't represent the interests or will of the American people. So it's clear we have an issue here on this side with the evangelical egregore. The evangelical egregore, this thing that tries to convince people that Jesus is a white man who, wears a red hat and loves, gun rights and other such things. This type of Jesus that seems to be almost identical to American movie star John Wayne, somehow, which Kristen Kobes-Dumas highlights in her book Jesus and John Wayne. You should definitely check that out if you haven't already. But it also appears in the throes of white feminism. Christina Cleveland talks about this very often, how, not only does this thing infect our lives in terms of trying to tell us that we should be flawless, needless, and strive to be as independent as possible to not need outside help in order to prove ourselves worthy to this thing calling itself God, but also that it infects even groups of people who are trying to look like at least they're doing the right thing. So white feminism specifically is a type of feminism that really doesn't seem to understand intersectionality, doesn't understand that concept, and that white feminists will be, for the most part, silent until something happens that affects them personally. Meanwhile, Black and Indigenous and other, women of color will have been screaming from the top of their lungs about incoming problems for a long, long time to no avail. The instance that Christina Cleveland uses in her book is actually, when Trump came into office, how there were people in those pink hats all around DC, and there was a lot of women, obviously talking about abortion rights and everything else, which are good conversations to have. But when Christina Cleveland and others came in there and, started trying to bring that intersectional element to it, focusing not just on the issues of women, but also on Black people and Black women who, intersectional get caught between them, these white women were just completely not on board. Because people don't understand the concept of intersectionality and they only focus on topics that affect only their group, they don't understand how the broader scope of sexism, for instance, will cross over into the realm of racism. And so what could be an ally for intersectional justice becomes very one-note, and in fact, white feminism can even be used to support white supremacy because of the ways in which white women, historically, have pushed for their rights and none others. Another good example of that is actually in the case of women even getting the right to vote. It was white women who were getting the right to vote first. Black women, Indigenous women, so many other women were getting their right to vote much later than white women. So this thing, this evil, this creature that I'm trying to explain that is out there, this thing is not the devil. This thing is not Lucifer. It's not Satan. It's not people. This thing is a thing called power. And it's here we might take a glance at actually Jewish Kabbalah, right? So Kabbalah being a type of Jewish mysticism, I will say very clearly that this is a closed practice. This isn't something that people should be just kind of practicing, right? Kabbalistic magic has its own very interesting history to talk about, which we might talk about another time. However, right now, the main issue is that Kabbalah is a Jewish practice as part of the Jewish religion. There are a lot of stipulations. There's a lot of beliefs that you gotta be like 40 years old before you even start knowing about it, because it's so complicated and you have to have this level of wisdom to really get into it. However, there are a couple concepts from Kabbalah that really everyone should know about, and that is mainly the ways in which the tree of life work, and by extension in the occultist realm, the tree of death, or the tree of knowledge, which is known as the Cliffo. So we have the Sephiroth, which is the tree of life, then we have the Cliffo, which is the tree of death, and they are mirror images of each other. The general concept is that when God created the world, he separated himself from all that is. If we remember in Genesis when it talks about God just kind of skating over those murky primordial waters, it's from those dark, murky waters of chaos that he just defined everything, right? So when he defined everything, then suddenly the bookcase could no longer be the Monster energy drink, right? These now became two entirely separate things that are no longer ever the same. They're no longer congealed in that big puddle of goo that is the primordial waters. That's the idea of creation, that it's God pulling things from the water and separating them so the bird can never be the rock again, and the rock can never be the tree again, and the tree can never be the lizard again, and so on and so forth. In doing this, God also defined elements of himself, and he defined himself out of that goo as well. So the Sephiroth are things that emanated from him, and they are spheres, concepts that really they represent certain ideals, right? So we have understanding, we have love, we have wisdom, we have severity, and we have all of these other different things. And you'll notice in the map here that the thing that is severity or power is held in line with love or mercy. The reason that these two things are held together is because if you have one without the other, everything falls apart. If you have all love and you have no power, you have no structure, you cannot protect that which you love, right? You cannot create boundaries for that which you love. If you love something and you have no power, then you can't defend it. Likewise, if you have power and no love, it's a bad time, because then there is no second chances, there is no considerations, there's no mercy. It's all just power, separation, boundaries, laws, just pure and undiluted rigidity. And so without that balance, there's a lot of pain that can happen. So as these are all aspects of God, of course, God himself has to be merciful, but also has to put down some laws and put down some boundaries and some rules, right? So there has to be that balance. But what occultists believe is that at one point that sphere, severity, burst out, managed to get unaligned, and wanted to essentially create its own thing. And if we remember this thing, Gebuda, which is what it's called, is just power. Power wanted its own domain. So when they finally wrestled it back in line, a piece of it stayed behind to create what occultists call the Cliffo. These anti-worlds, these excrements of creation, these husks of which all creation burst out of. This thing went to these husks that wisdom and love all burst out of, and tried to make them into his own mirror world of the Sephiroth. And when he did that, this is where now in occultism we find ourselves in a world full of the demons and the unsavory and unclean spirits all over the place in here. But it seems that was not enough for this creature. And so throughout time we could see a lot about the DemiUrge, for instance, in Gnosticism, this idea that there is some ignorant material god masquerading as the true god that is poisoning humanity. This is a Coptic Gnostic concept that, frankly, in my opinion, is anti-Semitic because it points to the Old Testament God as this DemiUrge, and that Jesus' father is the one true God, Christian God's the one true God. I shouldn't have to explain why that's anti-Semitic. But nonetheless, if we look at that concept, if we look at the evangelical egregore, we can see that the concept of something else pretending to be God has been around for a long, long time. And that's where I bring this theory forward, that this thing pretending to be God is that little sliver of Gebuda. It is this little thing that created this whole anti-world, this whole tree of death, or as some might say, the tree of knowledge. And so we might think that in Genesis, when God says don't eat from that tree, it's not because he doesn't want us to know things. It's because that tree of death or tree of knowledge is the tree created by this essentially anti-God, and ever since that day, with the knowledge of good and evil, that thing has an inroad. That thing has an ability to convince us to do a lot of things that we really should not be doing. So whereas a lot of mainstream Christians see this as a battle between God and the devil, the reality is that Christian witches see is that God and the devil are two actors on a stage, in essence, that God and the devil are trying to see which people can actually see through the fog, which ones have eyes to see and ears to hear, which ones can realize that more than God, more than the devil, there is something further past them that is really causing all this problem. And it is actually, ironically, the devil that is working with God to keep it contained. The dragon that is mentioned in Revelation is this thing. This is a thing that wants so desperately to be divine. And when we get a lot of those stories about the devil wanting to have been the creator, no, they picked up on the wrong thing. It's this thing who once was part of God and since then got severed and cut off and has been bitter about it ever since. And that is the thing that I believe is at the root of it all. And what is the name of this thing again? Remember, it's Gebuda, which means power, severity. It is power without love to balance it out. That is the root of the evil in this world. That is the dragon trying to chop it all down, is sheer, pure power with no love to balance it out. When you see the evangelical egregore, you see a Jesus that has no love in him, only power. That is the kind of Jesus that evangelical egregore set out to show to the people and that they snapped up. They didn't want a Jesus that talked about love, that talked about forgiveness, that talked about turning the other cheek. They wanted a Jesus with the flaming sword. They wanted a Jesus that would destroy all their enemies, right? And so that's what we find with evangelical Christianity, especially now as people talk about the Sermon on the Mount being too liberal and too weak. I feel like a lot of people get into witchcraft because they want more power for their own selves, their own missions, their own aspirations. They want to just be able to rearrange the world in a way that benefits them. But the more you learn about this kind of stuff, the more you learn about the world and theology, the more you realize that witchcraft is a very large responsibility. It's not a responsibility that everyone can handle. And so when I say Christian witch, I don't just mean someone who's out here, mucking around with the world for their own gain. I mean someone who understands the gravity of what it means to have this kind of power and to use it for good, and the risks that come with using it for good. Because as we know, a lot of the prophets and even Jesus himself did not meet the finest endings for the work that they did. But it's work that needs to be done regardless. And that's where being a Christian witch means being that activist, that mystic, that DemiUrge that is not scared to do it. And so again, even if I never cast another spell in my life again, I will always understand the interconnectedness that I have with the world God made. I will always understand how to communicate with my God. I will always understand how to fight for the values that he has told us to fight for. And I will always be out there with open arms for those who are fleeing a broken institution whose stones are crashing down onto them. With that said, I hope this helps you understand a little bit more about where we're coming from with Christian witchcraft, not just as a religious expression, not just as a method of spirituality, but specifically as a political identity. With all that said, I will see you guys next time, and we'll talk about some less crazy stuff. So, see you guys. Have a good rest of your week.